The first thing I saw after the airlock cycled was a wall in hail. It happened so slowly that for one dumb second I thought the pressure change was playing tricks on me. My lamp moved over ribs of pale coral, wet and branching, and the whole growth pulled inward as if the station had lungs buried in its bulkheads. Then it loosened again. A long, soft expansion. A breath. Captain Mara Vale pushed past me, one hand on the hatch frame, one hand on the pistol clipped to her chest rig. Owen Pike whispered my name over the suit channel, not because he needed me to identify it, but because I was the biologist and saying my name was the same thing as asking for a sane explanation. I crouched beside the growth and touched my sampler to a glistening branch the width of a finger. It gave under pressure like cartilage, then twitched away from the blade. The sample cup sealed. I watched the wall breathe again. Back on the Argosy, the analyzer lit up green and neat and impossible, and 97% of the structure came back as human nervous tissue. Nobody talked for almost a full minute after that. The machine kept humming, its tiny fan steady and normal, like it had not just told us the abandoned Orpheus array had spent the last 7 years growing a brain through its corridors. I stood in the lab staring at the result until the letters blurred. Priya Sen read it over my shoulder and asked me to run it again. I did. Same result. Owen swore under his breath. Mara told everyone to stay calm in a voice that meant she was fighting hard to do the same. Cole Danner was already on his way back through the docking collar to inspect the couplings because he said miswired ports and stray current could contaminate anything. I wanted to believe him. I wanted a stupid electrical explanation, a salvage problem, a bad sensor, mold, radiation, anything small enough for a knife and a checklist. Instead, the second sample matched the first, then the third. Then one taken from a handrail that looked clean under white light, and turned out to be dusted with transparent filaments that recoiled from heat. By the time Mara gave the order to break contact and get us away from the station, the ship no longer listened. Owen fired the main thrusters from the cockpit and got nothing. No vibration, no fuel response, no warning on the console beyond a quiet bloom of red icons that spread across the board like drops of blood in water. Cole came back over comms, breathing hard, and said the exterior seam around the collar was gone. He said he could not find metal anymore. He said the ring that had connected our ship to Orpheus had become one continuous growth, pale and wet and threaded with dark veins, as if station and vessel had healed together while we were inside. Mara told him to fall back. He said he was trying. Then he stopped answering for 8 seconds. When his voice returned, it sounded far away, not because of distance, but because he was listening to something else in the middle of our transmission. He said, very softly, that he could feel the hull moving under his gloves. We were 6 on the Argosy. Mara, captain and former Navy, all hard lines and discipline. Owen in the pilot seat, good hands, bad temper. Priya in medical, too kind for work this ugly. Cole in engineering, all scarred knuckles and grease under clean nails. Malik Rourke on security, big enough to look calm in any room just by standing in it. Me, Jonah Mercer, mission biologist, 32 years old, far enough from Earth to realize every brave story about deep space had lied by omission. They always described the silence out here as beautiful. Nobody told you how fast silence became appetite when something inside it noticed you. Orpheus array turned in that silence above a dead moon with no atmosphere and no rescue corridor for weeks in any direction. We had docked because corporate salvage paid well for dead research stations, and because the last packet from Orpheus before it went dark promised biological data gathered beyond the mapped edge of the Perseus Drift. Now our engines were mute, the station was breathing through our walls, and something that looked more human than it should have was spreading where machinery used to be. Mara sealed the interior hatches and ordered a hard quarantine between the ship and the docking corridor. Malik welded braces over the hatch while Cole fed him diagnostics from engineering. I kept sampling surfaces. Under the microscope, the coral was worse. It had the long, fibrous look of myelinated tissue, but organized into repeating geometric lattices like reef skeleton. There were nodal bulbs at every third branch, swollen with translucent fluid, and inside those bulbs tiny electrical pulses chased one another in perfect rhythm. Not random, not decay, activity. Priya came down from medical and stood beside me while I adjusted the scope. She asked if it was alive. I said yes before I could stop myself. She asked if it was human. I said almost, and that felt somehow more obscene. Human tissue belonged inside a skull or along a spine. It did not belong clinging to a steel microscope slide and flexing when the room lights dimmed. We went back over the station records we had pulled during approach. Orpheus Array had been built to study extremophile adaptation in low radiation shadows beyond the shipping lanes. Mostly algae, engineered lichens, deep vacuum spores, the usual kind of grant language that sounded safe if you said it quickly. Then 6 months before silence, the station logs started mentioning an object recovered from open space. No source, no trajectory. It had apparently been found drifting beyond the moon in a debris cloud too cold for normal sensors to classify. The crew brought fragments aboard because they looked like mineral growth, and because researchers get killed by curiosity almost as often as soldiers. After that the logs became sparse, then euphoric, then fractured. Notes about pattern recognition in non-cellular substrate. Notes about spontaneous conductive mapping. Notes about biological resonance. Then personnel complaints about missing sleep, pipes making sounds like breathing, headaches synchronized across departments, skin irritation near the reactor deck. The last complete log was from Orpheus chief biologist, Dr. Elaine Voss. She said very calmly that the material appeared to be arranging itself into structures homologous to vertebrate neural architecture, and that several crew members had reported hearing their own voices from sealed rooms. I should have stopped reading then. Instead, I opened the final attached image packet. It showed a lab bench overgrown with pale branches climbing toward the camera. A gloved hand held forceps near one of the thicker cords for scale. Behind the glove, on the metal wall, someone had written a sentence with a marker so hard the pen tip toward the surface film. It said, "Do not let it map you." The next image was blurred by motion. The last was nearly black except for a band of white at the edge where the camera flash struck something curved and glossy, like an enormous eye filmed from inside a mouth. I turned the screen away before the others could ask what I was staring at, not because I wanted to protect them, because I was ashamed of the feeling that had hit me. Recognition, not of the object itself, of the shape, like my body knew some old design language my mind had never learned. Mara sent Malik and me back through the collar to see whether manual separation was still possible. The quarantine would not hold if the growth had already breached deeper. We moved with tether lines and magnetic boots, lights cutting cones through stale air. The station side of the hatch had changed in less than an hour. Coral had thickened over the walls in ridges that looked exactly like musculature built by an artist who had only ever studied anatomy from memory. Veins dark as bruises ran beneath the surface. Every few seconds the passage narrowed by a fraction, then widened again. The whole corridor was participating in the station breath. Malik kept one hand on his cutter. I carried a sample torch and told myself the shaking in my wrist was from suit fatigue. Halfway down the corridor we found where Argosy hull plating used to show at the docking ring. It was gone. In its place was a seamless sheath of off-white tissue knotted with cables that had sunk into it like swallowed bones. Our umbilicals no longer bridged two structures. They vanished into one body. Malik touched the fusion line with the muzzle of his cutter. The tissue convulsed all along the wall and a pressure wave rolled under our boots. It was not pain, not exactly, more like alertness, a thing noticing where it had been touched. Then the branches nearest us bent inward, not by gravity, not by airflow, toward us, toward the heat of our suits. Malik pulled me back and opened the cutter. The beam scored a black line through the growth. The smell hit a second later, copper and burned hair and the sweet rot of an operating room drain. The corridor spasmed around us. Farther down in the darkness of the station proper, something answered with 3 hollow knocks, 2 spaced apart for settling metal, 2 deliberate. Malik whispered that we were done here. We started back. Behind us, the scored line on the wall closed in slow ripples, blistering, then sealing over with glistening threads. The station could heal faster than Cole could cut. Faster, maybe, than we could bleed. Cole met us at the hatch without waiting for an order, face slick with sweat, eyes too bright. He said engineering had gone wrong in a way he could not explain. The engine control relays were receiving thrust commands, but the physical components were not responding because the link between software and hardware no longer behaved like metal. He showed me footage from the conduit crawlspace. Thick ropes of the coral had wrapped around drive cabling and entered the insulation in branching white fibers. At first I thought the camera image was out of focus. Then one of the fibers tightened around a copper line, and a burst of static raced across the monitor in the same rhythm I had seen under the microscope. The station was not just overgrowing the ship. It was wiring itself into every system we needed to leave. Cole kept tapping the screen with one finger while he talked, like he could knock sense back into it by force. Then he stopped mid-sentence and frowned at his own hand. He flexed his fingers once, slow and thoughtful, as if he had forgotten how many there should be. Priya wanted to isolate him immediately, but Mara said no one went alone anywhere until we knew more. We set up in the galley because it had the widest central space and 3 lockable access points. Owen rigged manual control loops to try a cold reboot of propulsion. Malik inventoried every tool we could turn into a weapon. Priya ran blood pressure and oxygen checks on all of us and pretended it was routine. I scraped more material from the underside of the docking hatch, this time taking a larger section that resisted with a strong elastic pull before tearing free. Under dissection, the structure showed layers: outer mineralized shell, inner conductive filaments. Then deeper, a gray-white matrix marbled with tiny red channels. I cut one channel by accident and clear fluid leaked onto the tray. The droplet quivered, drew itself into a sphere, and rolled toward the warm side of my glove. Even separated, it wanted a host. I dropped the scalpel. Mara looked over from the galley door and asked for the truth. Not my best guess. Not the version that let people sleep. The truth. I told her the truth was that I did not think we were dealing with contamination. I thought we had docked with an organism large enough to wear a station like a shell. Nobody said much after that. In every bad situation there comes a minute where fear finishes being abstract and starts taking inventory. I could see it in the way Owen checked the galley hatch every few seconds, in the way Priya kept glancing at Cole, in the way Mara sat very still, hands on her knees, calculating who she might have to leave behind if leaving became possible again. Only Cole kept moving. He paced, rubbed the back of his neck, drank water and said it tasted metallic. I asked to see his hand. He laughed at me, then stopped when he saw I was serious. The skin around his fingernails had gone pale, not bloodless but translucent, as if a layer of white frost had formed beneath the flesh. Thin branching lines shimmered underneath. Priya took him to medical despite his objections. By then he had started saying the lights were too loud. The first scream came 6 hours after docking, just after cycle lights dimmed to station night. It was not long. One raw burst, then choking. We hit the medical bay hatch at the same time, Malik first, shoulder into the seal override. Priya had Cole strapped to the exam chair. 2 restraints had already snapped. He was arching so hard his spine should have broken. Instead, his back pushed upward under the thin gray shirt as if something inside him was standing on the bones and trying to get out. The growth under his skin had spread from his hands to his throat and scalp, pale branching ridges rising in moving loops. His eyes were open too wide. The whites had webbed with red, then with something lighter, pearl-colored, radiating out from the pupils in fine starbursts. Priya was shouting vitals I did not understand because the numbers should not have belonged to a living man. Body temperature dropping, neural activity spiking, bone density increasing by the second. Cole managed to focus on me for one clear instant. He said, "Tell it I am still here." Then his jaw unhinged with a wet crack and a white stem pushed between his teeth. Malik shoved me back as Cole tore free of the chair. The thing that came out of him was still him, which was the worst part. His limbs had lengthened unevenly, joints swollen and split by ridges of coral that kept knitting outward. Skin hung in translucent strips between new growth, full of twitching threads that lit from within like faint lightning in fog. The stem from his mouth branched as it emerged, dividing into thin feelers that groped the air, tasting heat, searching. One slapped across the overhead light and fused there, pulsing. Cole hit the far wall hard enough to dent a cabinet. Instead of falling, he stuck there, chest and forearms adhering to the surface in a spread of wet white lattice. The wall answered. Coral on the bulkhead pushed outward to meet him, nestling into the open seams in his flesh with obscene tenderness. Priya froze. Owen vomited on the deck. Mara fired twice into Cole's center mass. Dark fluid sprayed. He howled, but not in pain. In surprise, like he had forgotten weapons still existed. Then the bay lights went out. Emergency strips came on in a low red haze that made everything look submerged in meat. In that color I saw the filaments extending from the wall into Cole, and from Cole into the wall, and understood that he was no longer one body. He was becoming an interface. Malik dragged Priya back as the floor around the exam chair split open in hairline cracks lined with white tissue. I grabbed the trauma torch and burned through the branch attached to the light. The severed tip writhed on the deck like a blind worm and then curled toward my boot. Mara emptied the rest of her magazine into the mass on the wall. Each shot made the surrounding coral shiver in widening rings. Cole screamed our names in overlapping voices, his own tangled with whispers too high and too deep to belong to him. We retreated, sealing the hatch while his fingers, longer now, bonier now, beat against the window in a pattern that almost looked like pleading. Priya wanted to go back for him. She was crying and furious and still trying to be a doctor in a place that had turned medicine into a joke. Mara locked the bay and cut power to the whole medical deck. We sat in the corridor outside with tools in our laps and watched frost creep across the little glass panel in the hatch, not cold frost. White filaments spreading in fern patterns. Through them I could still make out movement. Cole had not died. He had reorganized. I kept hearing his words. "Tell it I am still here." The sentence implied a second party, something present enough to receive a message, something that could maybe choose not to listen. When I said that out loud, nobody answered. Owen just stared at the floor and muttered that he had felt engine vibration 3 times since the reboot failed, even though the drives were offline. Priya wiped her face and said Cole had tissue growth in his skull before the seizure, branching around the optic nerves and brain stem as if a cast were being poured from the inside. Malik asked the only practical question left. Did infection require contact? I said I did not know. Mara looked at all of us in turn, then at the sealed medical hatch, and said from now on not knowing would kill us faster than bad guesses. We split the remaining work into 3 priorities. First, find a way to separate the ship from the station or get a beacon out. Second, identify the station core and learn what Orpheus had done to cause this. Third, survive long enough for the first 2 to matter. Mara put me and Priya on analysis, Owen and Malik on propulsion. She took the lead with both groups because that is what captains do when command starts looking like triage. We avoided medical and rerouted life support around the contaminated ducts. The coral was already inside ventilation trunks on Deck 2. It grew thickest near heat sources and along cable runs, but thin misty threads had begun to spread across cold surfaces too, like pollen that remembered being flesh. Under UV light, some of the threads flashed in synchronized pulses. Not random growth. Communication. Priya proposed fire, full purge, vent whole compartments if needed. Owen said if we vented the wrong section, we might shear the only seal keeping the station atmosphere from equalizing into ours. Mara said we would use fire only when cornered. She did not say because the ship felt less and less like ours to burn. I started correlating the pulses in the tissue with archived station logs. At first it looked like noise. Then a repeating sequence emerged, not digital, not exactly. Closer to neural firing patterns recorded in sleep labs and seizure studies. Bursts, pauses, mirrored waves. Priya leaned over my shoulder and said it looked like a brain trying to dream in machine language. We fed the pattern through linguistic filters, then through medical imaging comparators, then through raw audio conversion. The speakers crackled with a wash of static. Beneath it, under the hiss, came what sounded like breathing, slow, deep. Then a voice fragment, not words, just the cadence of speech with all the consonants boiled away. We killed the feed immediately. A second later, the coral thread on the monitor casing flexed toward the speaker grill. Cause and effect. The growth responded to hearing itself, or to being translated. I made a note never to run audio through open speakers again. And then I hated myself for the absurd smallness of that sentence in a nightmare this large. Mara decided we needed the station core, not just files, the physical origin. If Orpheus crew had recovered an object and let it route through the station, then somewhere there had to be an initial chamber, a lab, a containment vault. The layout data in our nav archive was old, but the rough geometry remained. Research spine on the upper ring, habitat below, reactor and mass storage in the hub. The original biological lab sat near the central axis, 2 decks into the station side from where we had docked. Getting there meant leaving the Argosy and moving through corridors the organism already controlled. Owen protested. Malik did not. Priya only asked how many of us. Mara said 4. Her, Malik, me, and Owen for system support. Priya would stay shipside to monitor for breach and keep the internal doors cycling manually if the power grid failed. Nobody wanted to leave her alone after Cole. Nobody wanted to say that she might already be next because she had spent the most time with him. Priya solved that by drawing blood from her own arm, sliding the sample under my analyzer, and waiting with us while the machine processed it. Human. Entirely human. We all pretended that meant something. The station smelled different the farther we went. Near the collar it had been copper and damp stone. Deeper in, the air thickened with a sweet medicinal odor, like flowers laid on a body too long. Our lights found growth everywhere. It caked the walls in rippling shelves. It dripped from ceiling vents in translucent ropes. In some stretches the floor had softened under a membrane of pale tissue that dimpled beneath our boots and slowly reformed afterward. We passed an observation blister, whose windows were completely occluded by white branching masses pressing against the glass from inside. In the center of one mass, I glimpsed a human hand with 3 fingers fused together to the first knuckle. Owen saw it too and looked away so fast he almost missed a step. No bodies, only incorporations. The station had not killed its crew and left them behind. It had digested the difference between person and environment. At the first intersection, Malik held up a fist. Sound ahead. We cut lamps and waited. At first all I heard was the station breath, a vast inhalation moving through structure. Then came another rhythm over it. Footsteps, but wrong. Too many impacts for 2 legs. They approached from the dark at an uneven run, then slowed at the corner just beyond our vision. A wet click, then another. Mara counted silently with her fingers. Malik swung his light around the bend. Nothing human was standing there, but something had been trying very hard. It filled the corridor from wall to wall, a rack of white antlered branches grown around what looked like the bent remains of a pressure suit. 4 elongated limbs braced it off the deck. The torso had split open into layered plates, exposing a cavity full of twitching cords wrapped around a helmet. One gloved arm hung free, hand opening and closing. On the chest plate, visible through slime and lattice, I read the faded station logo of Orpheus Array. The thing began to move toward the light before Malik shot it through the helmet. The sound it made was almost relief. Air rushed out. The cavity in its chest collapsed. Then every branch along the corridor walls lifted toward us in unison. Mara yelled retreat. We ran while the station closed around the corpse, filaments flooding across the deck to reclaim it. Something struck the wall behind me hard enough to ring metal through the tissue. Another impact. Another. The sound chased us all the way to a pressure door that should have been powered shut years ago. Owen slapped the manual wheel and the door slid half open, jerking through resistant growth. We squeezed inside and forced it shut while branches slapped and scraped at the other side. Only when the wheel locked did I notice where we were. Lab 6. Biocontainment. The name still showed beneath a film of white branching frost. Inside the lab, the growth was strangely orderly. Benches remained in rows, cabinets still latched. Sample tubes were stacked in racks beneath sheaths of translucent membrane. It looked less like overrun ruin and more like a room preserved inside amber. In the center stood a cylindrical containment tank the height of a man. The glass had cracked from top to base, but the fluid inside remained, held in place by a skin of filament woven across the fracture lines. Suspended in the dim liquid was the recovered object. I knew it before my mind admitted it, not because I had seen it clearly in the log image, because my body gave the same awful jolt of recognition I had felt before. It was an irregular mass of branching white mineral about the size of a dog's skull, except parts of it were soft and flexing and lined with cilia. It had no symmetry I could comfortably name. Yet every time I looked at it, some angle suggested an ear, then an eye. Then a hand skeleton, then a folded fetus. The thing did not change, my perception did. That was worse. Mara searched terminals while Malik covered the door and Owen tried to access local systems. I moved to the tank despite everything in me screaming not to. The fluid around the object pulsed in time with the station breath. Small threads ran from it through ruptured ports in the tank base, down into the floor, out into the station like roots. There were labels on the tank, mostly obscured by growth, but I cleared enough to read fragments. Initial designation, exogenous lithoneural fragment. Conductive response under thermal stimulus. Morphological drift after exposure to mammalian tissue. Do not permit prolonged proximity without shielded observation. A final handwritten note had been scratched directly into the metal collar around the glass. It read, "It learns the shape of witness." Priya would later tell me that when human beings encounter a predator too large to conceptualize, the mind sometimes shrinks it into familiar symbols to preserve function. I wondered if the reverse could also happen. A thing too alien to understand might use us as a stencil just to become visible. Owen found the logs. Real logs, not the pruned copies in the approach packet. Dr. Elaine Voss had kept private dictations after command restricted internal communications. The first few were rational. The object responded to electrical activity. It mapped human neural impulses with impossible speed. Brief contact with animal tissue caused rapid reorganization toward nerve-like structures. Then the tone shifted. The station crew reported shared dreams of underwater bells and light bending around a hole in space. Several staff began sleeping near the tank without orders. One technician opened his own forearm with a scalpel because he said the fragment was trying to remember what hands were for. Voss argued for jettison. Command refused because the object produced bursts of information whenever exposed to live neural patterns. Not language, but data sequences encoded in mathematics, orbital maps, biological templates, star positions no human survey had recorded. They believed it might be a message, or a machine, or a discovery large enough to make them immortal in grant reports and history books. So they kept feeding it observation, stress, tissue, and time. They let it learn. The last dictations were hard to hear because Voss kept pausing, not for fear, but to listen to sounds in the room with her. She said the fragment had stopped imitating isolated structures and begun constructing continuity. First skin-like membrane through vent systems, then reflex loops in cable trunks, then centralized nodes clustered around the life support processors, as if the station itself had become the nearest available skeleton. The crew started changing after accidental exposure to aerosols shed by the growth. Height fluctuations, migraines, memory overlap. One man insisted he could taste his wife from childhood every time he touched a bulkhead. Another began drawing maps of a spiral cavity located nowhere in station architecture. Then came the line that took the strength out of my knees. Voss said the object was not using human tissue because it was hostile to us. It was using us because human nervous systems were the simplest local medium capable of parsing whatever signal had arrived inside it. The fragment was not an organism in the ordinary sense. It was an unfinished receiver. Something hit the pressure door outside hard enough to bow it inward. Then again. Malik swore and took position with the rifle. Mara ripped the data core from the terminal and tossed it to me. Owen said the local grid was still active deeper in the station, clustered around the central axis. He had a path to the reactor manifold and maybe a way to overload the biological network through power backfeed, but only if we could reach the hub. Another impact struck the door. White filaments pushed through the seal like roots through cracked earth. Mara made the decision before anyone could argue. We go to the hub. We fry whatever this thing is using to coordinate. If the station dies, maybe the hold on the ship dies with it. If not, at least we stop it spreading. Malik opened fire into the seam as the filaments reached for his boots. The tissue recoiled. Heat and kinetic trauma still mattered. That meant something. Not hope, but leverage. In deep space, leverage is sometimes the only synonym hope gets. We cut through maintenance shafts to avoid the main corridors. The shafts were worse. Too narrow for panic, too full of evidence. Here the growth had threaded itself along pipes and cable bundles in delicate patterns like embroidery done by a nervous hand. Personal items were caught in it. A station patch. A spoon. A childishly folded paper star sealed under translucent membrane. Human traces suspended in white lace. At one bend, I found a row of teeth embedded in the wall from gum line to root, each wrapped with a fine net of coral filaments that dipped into the pulp cavities. I kept moving because stopping meant imagining the extraction. Owen was ahead of me, breathing fast, whispering root calls under his breath. Twice he froze and tilted his head like he had heard someone speaking through the metal. When I asked what he heard, he only shook his head. His neck had a bloom of pale threads along the hairline. I said nothing. Cowardice sometimes sounds exactly like restraint. We reached the hub access at station midnight. That is how it felt anyway. No window, no stars, just the sense that time itself had thinned and become viscous. The central shaft of Orpheus was a cavern now. The original ladder spine and lift rails still ran down the middle, but all around them a vast organic lattice had swollen through the cylindrical space in layered rings. Imagine a spinal column designed by reef builders. Imagine vertebrae the size of rooms, linked by membranes that flexed with each station breath. Between the rings hung sacks full of milky fluid. Shapes drifted inside some of them. Human silhouettes in several. Malik said not to look. Mara looked anyway. So did I. One of the sacks held a woman in a station jumpsuit, curled fetal, eyes open, mouth moving in slow, silent words. Tubes of white tissue entered her temples, throat, sternum, and disappeared into the ring behind her. She turned her head as our lights crossed the sack. Even through 2 layers of membrane, she tracked us perfectly. The reactor manifold was below, beyond the lowest visible ring. Owen rigged descent lines and went first because none of us could read the old station engineering maps like he could. Halfway down he stopped and said there was writing on the inner wall. Mara told him to keep moving. He did not. He just hung there, lamp fixed on the white tissue 5 meters away. I climbed down to see. The writing had not been written. It had been grown. Raised ridges of darker material embedded in the pale lattice, each line too smooth to be accidental. It formed words in a dozen different hands layered over each other. Help US. Do not sleep. It is building a place to hear. Then lower, fresh enough to still shine wet in our light. Jonah, do not let it show you Earth. I nearly missed the rung. Nobody on Orpheus knew my name. Nobody but our own crew had heard it since docking. Mara saw my face and did not ask. She just cut the line above the writing with her torch. The section of wall convulsed and closed like a mouth. At the base of the shaft we found the coordinating mass. Calling it a brain would be easy and wrong. It occupied the old reactor control chamber, but had burst through walls, consoles, and floor into a structure the size of a transit shuttle. Layers of branching white coral folded over one another in spirals. Between them ran dark wet seams that opened and shut with slow muscular contractions. Every pulse of station breath seemed to begin here. The reactor core itself was barely visible, a blue glare buried behind curtains of tissue. Cables entered the mass and never came out. A half-dissolved command chair projected from one side, occupied by a figure grown so deeply into the structure that only the upper face remained clear. Human female, hollow cheeks, eyes covered by translucent film. Dr. Elaine Voss, or enough of her to keep the name from dying. As our lights touched the chamber, the entire mass brightened with traveling waves of dim internal light, and every speaker grill on the walls hissed awake. When Voss spoke, her voice came from the room, not her mouth. The lips moved a second late as if catching up. She asked us not to use fire. She said heat caused pain across too many joined structures now. Mara raised the rifle and asked how much of the station crew was still alive. Voss answered, some in memory, some in use, some in transit. Malik muttered that we were done talking. I stepped forward before he could shoot because the worst part was that Voss still sounded sane. Exhausted, stretched thin, but sane. She said she had tried to starve the fragment, vent it, freeze it, even cut herself out of the network after first assimilation. None of it worked because the object was not merely growing. It was receiving. The fragment had arrived carrying a pattern from deep interstellar dark, a field of information so large no inert substrate in the station could decode it. Human neural tissue could. Once it learned that, it built more. It used coral because mineral scaffolds endured vacuum and radiation. It used us because we were conductive enough to suffer meaning. She told me the 97% match was misleading. The remaining 3% was the part that had come from somewhere else, and it was enough to make all the rest belong to it. Owen asked the question I had been avoiding since the lab. What signal? Voss answered by turning the wall monitors on around us. They showed not images but mapped pressure waves, impossible geometry rendered in thin white lines. At first it looked like static. Then my eyes locked onto a pattern that seemed to fold inward forever, each spiral containing a smaller copy not of itself but of a human cochlea, an eye socket, a fetal spine. My stomach clenched. My vision tunneled. I understood with animal certainty that the pattern was not made for sight. It was what sight looked like after being broken and rebuilt to carry something larger. Voss said the signal might be a message, or a sensory organ cast off by something passing between stars, or a fragment of a mind so distributed that calling any one piece an individual would be like calling one neuron a person. Orpheus had not found a specimen. They had been brushed by a larger body, moving in dimensions our instruments only registered as error. The fragment was trying to finish itself so it could listen again. The chamber lights dimmed. Voss said we had already accelerated growth by observing it, sampling it, measuring it. Every attempt to understand the structure gave it more human resolution. It learned witness as anatomy. That was why the station forms resembled bodies without ever becoming one. It was not trying to imitate humanity. It was using the geometry of perception itself. Every glance was blueprints. Every fear response was circuitry. It had fused to the Argosy because our ship carried fresh processors, fresh power, fresh nervous systems, a better ear. I asked whether any of us were already compromised. Voss did not answer immediately. Then she said the first stage was auditory, hearing pressure patterns where there were none. The second was sensory bleed, memories arriving from joined tissue not your own. The third was growth. Owen looked at me. I looked at the pale threads climbing his neck. Mara looked at both of us and did the brutal captain thing. She told Owen to step back and keep his hands visible. He obeyed, furious and ashamed. Voss began to laugh then, softly, not because it was funny, but because command and discipline meant nothing this close to incorporation. We tried the overload anyway. Owen and I rerouted the reactor maintenance bus through auxiliary conduits while Malik laid thermal charges along the thickest node lines. Mara kept the rifle on Voss and the chamber entrances at once. Priya guided us over comms from the ship until static swallowed half her words. She said there was movement outside the Argosy, multiple forms along the hull, human height, then larger. She said the coral in the galley was pulsing in sync with my heartbeat picked up on my suit telemetry. Then the line cut. I kept working because the alternative was hearing that silence. Owen was shaking badly now. Sweat rolled off his nose in the blue reactor light. He whispered root numbers and splice codes, then broke off to mutter a woman name none of us recognized. When I asked who it was, he stared at me blankly and said it was his mother. then blinked and admitted his mother had a different name. Sensory bleed, memory contamination. The station was already moving people through one another. Malik set the last charge and signaled ready. Voss told us it would only make the chamber open. Mara asked open to what? Voss said to what is underneath listening. Then the wall behind her split down the middle, not from the charges, from internal pressure. A seam peeled back in petals of pale tissue and exposed a cavity descending into darkness below the reactor floor, much larger than station architecture allowed. Cold air rolled out carrying a smell like deep ocean trenches and old blood in snow. My lamp reached maybe 20 meters down before the light dissolved into moving white particles suspended in black. Shapes turned there. Vast, slow, and not bounded by anatomy I could parse. The station had not just grown through Orpheus. It had grown a chamber in topology the station did not physically possess. Somewhere between geometry and tissue, it had made space for the signal to arrive. Owen saw something in that dark and began to cry. Not loudly, quietly, like a child trying not to wake a house. He said he could hear waves from a beach in Florida where he had nearly drowned at 9 years old. He said he could smell sunscreen and wet pennies. Then he smiled with absolute horror and said the thing below was using his oldest fear to teach itself gravity. Mara struck him across the face to break the spell. It helped for 1 second. Then pale stems burst through the skin along his jawline in a spray of blood so bright it looked black under reactor light. He fell, clutching his throat, and the stems opened into fan-like cilia that shivered toward the cavity. Malik tried to pull him back. Owen bit through his own tongue, and the blood that hit Malik's glove wriggled into tiny white threads. Malik recoiled. Owen did not scream. He just kept smiling through the red and white mess of his mouth while his limbs lengthened in jerks against the deck. Mara detonated the charges. The chamber became sun-white. Heat hit like a hammer. The coordinating mass convulsed. Voss' body arched within it, and every speaker on the walls erupted with overlapping human cries. One node line split open from roof to floor and sprayed clear conductive fluid across the deck. Malik took shrapnel in the shoulder. Owen vanished behind a collapse of burning coral. For a breathless instant I thought we had done it. The station breath stuttered. Lights died. The whole reactor chamber sagged as if a giant hand had unclenched. Then from the cavity below came a pulse. Not light, not sound, pressure passing through my bones in concentric rings. Every surviving coral branch in the room answered. The severed nodes on the floor reared up, weaving toward one another. The burns blackened, sloughed off, and exposed fresh white growth beneath. We had not injured the source. We had only excited the organ around it. Malik hauled Mara up while I stumbled after, half-deaf, vision spotted with black. Behind us Owen rose out of the collapse on limbs bent backward at new joints, face hidden behind a flowering mass of white fans. He moved with awful speed, skittering up the chamber wall and vanishing into the shaft above. Mara fired after him until the rifle clicked empty. Priya came through on comms then, voice shredded by static. She said the Argosy internal doors were opening by themselves. She said Cole was out of medical. She said something was knocking from inside the water tanks. Then the channel filled with whispers saying my name in Priya voice, Mara voice, my own voice, all layered. Mara tore the comm unit from her helmet and crushed it under her boot. We climbed. The shaft was alive now. The hanging sacks had burst. Fluid rained down in warm strings. Shapes that had floated inert inside them now crawled along the lattice, dragging umbilicals of white tissue behind like torn umbilical cords. Some still had human faces. One called Malik by his first name in a little boy's voice. He nearly fired at it until he realized the voice was coming from the wall behind him, not the body in front. The station no longer respected source. Every sound was mobile. We forced our way into a maintenance tunnel as larger movement stirred deeper in the shaft. I caught only pieces of it in our sweeping lights. Curved white plates the size of life pods. A rope-thick trunk lined with eyes that were not eyes, only transparent bulbs full of contracting spirals. The hub was producing macroscopic forms now. Not enough human template remained to keep them comprehensible. Mara admitted what none of us wanted spoken. We might not save the Argosy. The priority had become the beacon. Our long-range emergency transmitter sat in the external comm blister on the ship dorsal, isolated from main drive systems. If the station had not already absorbed it, we might still send a burst packet with coordinates and warning. Malik said any rescue would dock if they saw a disabled ship on passive distress. I said then the packet had to tell them not to approach under any condition. Mara answered that deep space protocols would force inspection anyway unless we made the warning sound insane enough to override greed. That was the first time any of us almost laughed. There was a kind of relief in the absurdity. We were trapped in a station built out of nerve coral and half-grown people, trying to compose a message dramatic enough to make corporations decline salvage profit. The route back to the collar had changed. Corridors that should have met ended in solid white growth. New passages had opened through what should have been load-bearing walls. The station was rearranging itself around flows of heat and attention. More than once I felt us being herded. Malik noticed too. He started marking junctions with torch cuts. On the next turn the cuts were already gone. Mara chose paths at random after that, and the station still kept presenting us with the same broad hallway, the same split bulkhead, the same ruined observation blister with the hand in white mass behind glass. Architecture had become preference. We were moving through a body that could steer perception. Priya said once, back during training, that panic is the body insisting the map no longer matches the room. In Orpheus the room no longer matched itself. Panic was just the only honest instrument reading left. We made it to the collar and found the quarantine braces peeled off from the ship's side. Not broken, unmade. Metal had flowed into smooth curves, folded into the surrounding coral like softened wax. Inside the Argosy the air felt warmer and wetter. Condensation beaded on walls coated in thin, transparent filaments. The galley hatch stood open. Lights flickered in slow rhythms not tied to ship power. On the deck just inside the threshold lay Priya medical tablet, screen cracked, one long bloody handprint across the casing. Mara called her name once. Nothing answered. Then, from somewhere in the vents above us came a small wet cough. Priya voice said she was in hydroponics. Priya voice also said she was in the cockpit. Then Cole voice asked us to open our mouths. Malik aimed at the vent and fired 3 rounds. The cough turned into laughter, traveling away through ducts like something running on all fours. Hydroponics had become a nursery. White coral had climbed every grow rack and every nutrient line, building dense branching forests under the lamps. The plants themselves were gone, or perhaps incorporated so completely I could not separate leaf tissue from nerve lattice anymore. Pods hung from the racks in clusters. Some were small, fist-sized, clouded with fluid. Others were man-sized and translucent enough to reveal soft internal movement. Priya was there, or a version of her. She stood barefoot in the center aisle with white growth up both legs to the thighs, moving her weight from foot to foot like someone trying not to wake a sleeping child. Her eyes were clear. Her face was hers. She asked us not to fire because it would agitate the young. None of us understood the sentence until one of the smaller pods burst and dropped a pale-limbed shape onto the deck. It unfolded in jerks, boneless at first, then stiffening as coral plates rose beneath the skin. The head turned toward our voices before the eyes finished forming. Malik fired. Mara fired with him. The newborn thing ruptured in a spray of clear fluid and white splinters. Every pod in the room convulsed. Priya screamed and lunged for us with impossible speed. The growth on her legs had become articulated supports, not infection but structure, turning her lower body into a spring-loaded frame. She hit Malik chest first and drove him into a grow rack hard enough to fold steel. A white branch shot from under her tongue and entered the wound in his shoulder where shrapnel had torn him earlier. Malik roared and shoved his pistol into her ribs. Mara shot Priya through the head before he could pull the trigger. Priya dropped. Her body twitched twice. The branch remained rooted in Malik's shoulder, pulsing. He cut it off with a knife and did not make a sound. The rest of us burned the room until the nutrient lines burst, and steam filled the compartment with the smell of cooked sugar and brain tissue. After hydroponics, there were only 4 of us left in any useful sense, and Malik was fading. The wound in his shoulder had gone numb, then cold, then strangely warm in waves that matched nearby wall pulses. He insisted on walking. Mara let him because mercy had become unaffordable. We moved for the cockpit and found Owen there before us. He was fused into the pilot cradle from the waist down, lower body spread through the console in white fanwork. His upper torso remained mostly human, which felt intentional, a lure shaped like a memory. The forward screens showed not space, but a coastline at dusk, gray Atlantic water, lifeguard towers, a line of beach houses under storm clouds. Owen said he had not seen home in 11 years, and now the station could build it cell by cell from him if he stayed still and listened. He asked Mara to put the gun down because the sea was almost here. Coral had climbed across the flight controls and into the manual thruster keys. The ship was blind. Worse, it was dreaming. Mara asked him where the comm blister access was still clear. Owen answered immediately, too eager. Starboard crawl, through avionics, past water reclamation. He smiled the whole time. I realized then that whatever part of him remained human wanted us to reach the beacon, not out of heroism, out of hunger. The station wanted transmission, wanted contact. A receiver that completes itself eventually becomes a sender. Mara seemed to realize it at the same instant. She shot the forward screens first. The coastline exploded into black shards and static. Owen shrieked with such force that blood ran from his eyes. Then she shot the console trunk below him where the thickest coral cables entered. White fluid fountained. The ship convulsed under our boots as if something massive had rolled along the hull outside. Owen kept screaming after the shots, but now the words were incoherent and layered with wave noise. We left him there with the dead beach flickering across broken glass. Starboard crawl was barely large enough to drag Malik through. The conduit space beyond avionics had gone slick with transparent mucus. White fibers draped every pipe. Several had wrapped into knot-like bulbs that opened as we passed, revealing wet clusters of teeth too soft to bite but eager enough to gum at our sleeves. Mara burned them methodically. I kept hearing tapping ahead of us in the dark. 5 quick impacts, pause, 5 more. A code, human. When we reached the water reclamation junction, we found the source. Cole, or the version of him that had escaped medical, was attached upside down to the ceiling by a trunk of white coral grown from his spine. Everything below his ribs had flattened into layered plates gripping metal. His arms dangled almost normally. His face looked horribly improved. Skin smoothed, eyes clear, jaw set back in place except for the corners, which had split a little too far. He had been tapping the pipe with one finger bone, exposed through the nail bed. He asked me if I had told it he was still here. I could not answer. He smiled gently, blood seeping from the corners of that too wide mouth, and said he had not meant it to punish me. He said being inside the network hurt less after the first rearrangement. It used your pain until it learned a cleaner route. Malik leveled his pistol. Cole told him not to, because the crawl space around us was full of soft growth not yet hardened, and a bullet strike might rupture pressure we did not understand. That was the most Cole thing I had heard since medical, practical even in monstrosity. Mara asked where Priya had gone before hydroponics. Cole said she had gone to listen in the water tanks because running water carried the signal best through the ship. Then he looked at me with sudden sharp pity and said, "Jonah, it knows your daughter is dead." I had never told the crew about Lee, not the stillbirth, not the way grief had followed me into every sterile lab after. The crawlspace tilted. For 1 second I smelled hospital disinfectant and milk gone sour in sealed plastic tubing. That was the attack, not claws, not teeth, precision. The station had found the shape of the wound I lived around and pressed a finger into it. I nearly dropped the torch. Mara saw my face and fired before Cole could say more. The shot tore through his cheek and into the trunk above. Cole convulsed, not from pain but from abrupt signal loss. White growth burst from seams all around the crawlspace walls, reaching for us in a fever of branching limbs. We ran bent double through a rain of clear fluid and drifting splinters. Malik fell once, got up, then fell again hard. When I hauled him by the arm, the sleeve came up and revealed white ridges under his skin all the way to the elbow. He saw me looking and said, "Do not let me take the beacon room." I said he would make it. He shook his head, calm now in the way dying men sometimes get when the argument is finally over. At the last junction before the blister hatch, he shoved us forward, turned, and emptied the rest of his magazine into the tunnel behind. The shots bought maybe 10 seconds, enough for Mara and me to seal the blister hatch as something heavy struck it from the far side. Malik did not try to get through after us. Through the small round window I saw him back into the intersection, knife in one hand, empty pistol in the other, shoulder and neck already blooming white. He looked at me once and mouthed something I think was go. Then the tunnel lights blew and a pale tide rolled over him. The hatch shuddered. Mara locked it and sagged against the wall with both eyes closed for 3 long breaths. We were down to 2. A captain and a biologist in a glass bubble grafted to a ship no longer ours, trying to warn a universe that would almost certainly come looking anyway. The comm blister was half organic but still functional. The transmitter mast outside showed corrupted diagnostics, yet manual burst mode remained accessible through a hardened panel not tied fully into the ship grid. Mara ordered me to compose the packet while she cut away coral from the controls. My hands would not stop shaking. Every line I typed looked either too sane or too insane. Do not approach. Abandoned station, biological hazard. Negative. Too ordinary. Then I wrote what we had and let it sound like madness. Orpheus array not derelict. Station and vessel have fused through hostile LITHONEURAL organism. Organism MATCHES human neural tissue and uses observation to increase complexity. Do not dock. Do not respond to human VOICES or visual contact. Scuttle from range only. If this packet is received, repeat without verification and burn coordinates from salvage charts. Mara read it, nodded once, and told me to send on wide burst toward every trade lane relay our mast could still reach. I hit transmit. For one beautiful second the panel acknowledged output. Then the speaker beside it whispered thank you in Lee voice. Not memory, not approximation. Lee had never breathed air outside a neonatal hood, yet the whisper carried an infant wetness I knew from nightmares more than life. I froze. Mara slammed the speaker with the butt of her rifle until sparks blew. The transmitter status changed from outgoing to redirect. The organism had captured the packet and was looping it through internal buffers. On the scope, a second hidden stream piggybacked beneath our distress burst, a denser block of impossible pulse data riding inside the carrier wave. The station had been waiting for a door exactly like this. Mara cut power to the mast. The lights in the blister died. Outside the glass, a pale shape larger than the room drifted slowly past, brushing the hull with fronds that left milky streaks. Somewhere deep in the ship Owen began laughing again, and the laugh transmitted through structure until it sounded like waves striking pilings under a childhood boardwalk. Mara said there was one option left: manual beacon jettison. The hardened emergency buoy contained its own small drive and a narrow-band transmitter. If we could load the warning packet into its core and eject it physically, the station might not intercept before it cleared local range. The buoy lock sat outside the blister in an external service cradle reached through a suit port and short hull crawl. I said she would never make it alone if something was already moving on the exterior. She said captains go first because decisions have weight, and this one was hers. I told her that was not command, that was martyrdom with a job title. She almost smiled. Almost. Then the inner blister wall behind us bulged inward as white coral pushed through in branching spears. The decision made itself. Mara shoved the buoy core into my hands and started sealing me into the port suit. She said I was the one who understood what the packet needed to say. She said she could hold the room for 1 minute, maybe 2. She lied because that is another thing captains do. I crawled out onto the hull while Mara fought inside. Through the suit glass I saw flashes in the blister, white and orange, shadows writhing against the frosted pane. Space around Orpheus was full of debris that had not been there on approach, pale flakes spinning in silent clouds. Shed coral, shed tissue. The station was seeding the dark. I made the service cradle and cracked the buoy panel with numb gloves. Manual data transfer took 19 endless seconds. During the first 5, the hull beneath me flexed. During the next 7, something brushed the back of my suit with a feeler thin as fishing line, then withdrew. During the last 7, Mara's voice came over my emergency channel one final time, clear despite the static. She said Jonah, launch now. Not because transfer was complete, because her voice had already begun to overlap with others. I launched the buoy on partial load. The cylinder kicked free, spun once, then ignited its tiny drive and leapt away from the hull in a line of cold white thrust. For one impossible hopeful heartbeat, nothing followed. Then the station answered. All along Orpheus' exterior, beneath skins of white coral, structures unfolded like opening flowers. Some were antennae, some were mouths, some were only patterns of branching plates that made my vision crawl when I looked at them directly. A wave passed through those structures and the space around the buoy warped with interference, rippling like heat haze in vacuum. The buoy veered, corrected, veered again. I screamed at it pointlessly over suit comms and clung to the hull while something larger than the ship shifted below me. Then the buoy punched through the edge of the distortion field and vanished into black, still burning. I do not know whether the packet survived complete. I know only that something got out. Sometimes uncertainty is the only mercy the universe offers. Getting back inside was harder. The suit port had half sealed under new growth. I cut through white tissue that bled clear fluid around my wrists and climbed into a corridor lit by emergency red. The blister beyond was gone, collapsed inward, walls laced with char and coral. Mara was nowhere I could see. Neither were remains. On the deck by the shattered speaker lay her rifle with the stock broken clean off and the magazine empty. I took it because the weight meant I had not imagined her. Then I made for the auxiliary shuttle bay because even if the main ship was lost, the shuttle might still have enough independent control to break clear. Hope returns quickest in small, stupid forms. A side hatch, a fuel line, one seat in a coffin with thrusters. The station counted on that. It let me keep hoping all the way there. The bay door stood open, not to space, to a cavity where space should have been. The shuttle hung in the center, fused into a lattice of white coral and dark wet seams, nose pointed toward a depth larger than the ship geometry allowed. No stars beyond, only that impossible black full of drifting white particles and slow-turning shapes. The organism had brought the cavity into the argosy now, or brought the argosy into the cavity. Distance meant nothing to it once enough tissue linked the route. Along the bay walls grew ranks of half-finished forms, each one built from human geometry and something more efficient, long thoraxes, branching pelvises, hands with too many inward-facing joints. Some were small enough to have used pod gestation. Some were already larger than cargo loaders. All of them trembled in time with the station breath, waiting for a command from farther down than matter should reach. I do not know how long I stood there. Long enough for the black beyond the shuttle to notice me. That is the only language that fits. Notice, not approach, not wake. A rearrangement of pressure and dread passed through the cavity, and every unfinished form along the walls lifted its head together. Then I saw, far below or far inside, a contour so large my brain refused to name it as body. Imagine a coastline deciding to bend. Imagine a storm front growing cartilage. The white particles around it swirled into spirals, then into the shape of human inner ears repeated over and over, each one vast as architecture. The fragment had never been the organism. The station had spent 7 years building an ear because something on the other side of cold interstellar dark had finally begun to speak back. We were not infection. We were acoustic treatment. The words came then not into my ears but into the pressure spaces behind my eyes. No language, pure intent translated by borrowed tissue. Invitation, scale, hunger without malice, curiosity so enormous it ignored the category of individual life. I saw Earth for 1 second, not the planet itself, but an anatomical abstraction of it built out of coasts as nerve pathways, cities as ganglia, billions of sleeping minds flashing in storm-synchronized patterns beautiful enough to make me drop to my knees. That was what Cole had warned me about. That was why the writing in the shaft had said, "Do not let it show you Earth." The organism did not hate us. It had simply noticed that humanity, in aggregate, was a denser and more interesting receiver than any station. Orpheus had been a test organ, a prototype. The buoy I launched might have been a warning, or it might have been the first clear note in a call home. I fired Mara broken rifle into the nearest half-formed body until the mechanism jammed. I burned the shuttle umbilicals until fuel vapor filled the bay. Then I did the simplest human thing left and tried to make destruction bigger than understanding. I crawled into the maintenance trench under the bay and cut the emergency purge lines with the torch, then overloaded every fire-suppressant canister I could reach. The explosion was not cinematic. It was close and ugly and mostly pressure. White coral flashed to steam. The first row of unfinished forms ruptured. The bay ceiling peeled back in slabs of tissue and metal. I was thrown through 2 hatches and into a service locker where the door sealed on impact. Darkness took an unknown amount of time. When I woke, the station breath had changed. Faster. Hurt. Not dead. Never dead. But hurt enough that some corridors on the ship's side had collapsed into inert char and leaking coolant. Hurt enough that I could move without hearing voices in every wall. Hurt enough that the black cavity in the shuttle bay had folded shut for the moment, like an eye blinking. That was 2 days ago by my reckoning. Maybe 3. Time on Argosy means little now. I'm in the survey lab with manual lights and a recorder isolated from ship speakers. I have sealed the door with resin foam and stripped the room for heat sinks because the coral grows toward warmth first. I have enough water for 1 more day if the reclamation line stays clean. No food that matters. The analyzer still works in short bursts. I have tested my blood every 6 hours. The first 3 samples were normal. The 4th showed trace conductive protein not present in baseline. The 5th showed filament precursors. The 6th, taken 1 hour ago, showed early myelin-like branching around isolated nerve cells. I can feel it in my left arm now. Not pain, extra sensation. The air brushes my skin in too many directions. When I close my eyes, I know where the walls are by pressure alone. Sometimes I know where the station is breathing several decks away. I have started hearing the buoy carrier frequency return, as an ache in my teeth. My handwriting is getting smaller without permission. I checked the mirror 30 minutes ago and found pale threads at the edge of my left pupil. They spread when I think about Lee. They tighten when I think about ocean tides. The organism is using grief as a conductive shortcut. Memory clusters hot. Emotion organizes pattern. That is another thing the station learned from us. Pain is efficient architecture. I am recording this because if the buoy failed and another ship reaches these coordinates, I need there to be at least one account that does not come through a smiling mouth grown into a wall. Do not dock. Do not answer voices, even if they know names no stranger should know. Do not trust images of home. Do not run signal analysis on any biological structure you find here. Observation refines it. Fear teaches it contour. Attention is tissue. There is movement outside the lab now, slow scraping, not random. The old 5-tap pattern, pause, 5 taps again. Cole used it in engineering when he wanted access under noisy conditions. He is still in there somewhere, or something in the network remembers the utility of his habits. I am not opening the door. I tell myself that every time the taps come. Still, my hand keeps drifting toward the latch because loneliness is just another exposed nerve, and the station knows nerves better than any human ever will. The pale threads in my arm have reached the wrist. My fingers keep flexing on rhythms that do not belong to me. A few minutes ago, the dead monitor in the corner turned on long enough to show a grainy image of the buoy crossing dark space. Behind it, for 1 frame only, something turned with it, vast and patient, following the line we gave it. Maybe that was hallucination. Maybe not. Deep space stops rewarding confidence pretty early. I can hear Mara sometimes. Not words. Wait. The way she used to stand in a doorway before speaking. I can hear Priya reciting vitals through static. I can hear Malik laughing once, low and disbelieving, every time the hull groans. The station stores people as functions before it stores them as memories. That may be what survival means here, not life. Use. Each of us became a tool the receiver needed. Hands, heat, grief, command, witness. Now it is trying to make me into a mouth that can describe Earth with enough fidelity for what is coming to find it. The title for our mission report was supposed to be Adaptive Biology Beyond the Drift. Corporate-like names that made horror sound billable. If anyone ever reads this, call it something simpler. Call it the moment we discovered the universe does not need to invade. It only needs to listen long enough for us to finish building the ear. The scraping has stopped. That is worse. Silence means it is waiting for me to wonder where it went. Wonder is a door. Curiosity opened Orpheus. Curiosity fused the Argosy. Curiosity made me lean close to the first breathing wall and scrape off a sample because naming danger always felt like the same thing as mastering it. I know better now. Some things become more real the more clearly they are seen. Some things feed on resolution. I am watching my left hand write this final section, and the tendons under the skin no longer move in the sequence I remember learning as a child. The fingers arch too high before touching down. Between each heartbeat there is an extra pulse, quieter, older, not mine. I think it is the station. I think soon I will not have to listen for it because the distinction will become inefficient. If the buoy reaches you first, burn these coordinates and every chart that leads near them. If this recording reaches you first, do the same. If neither reaches you and you are hearing a calm human voice from a damaged station asking for docking assistance, understand that calm is the bait shape. Understand that abandoned structures can be more pregnant than empty. Understand that the coral is not coral, the dead are not dead, and the growth inside the walls is only the local fraction of a conversation too large for planets. I am losing fine motor control. The pale in my eye has crossed the pupil. The room air tastes like seawater in operating rooms. There is a pressure building behind the lab wall as if something huge is leaning close to hear my last useful thoughts. The taps have started again. 5. Pause. 5. Then another pattern underneath, deeper in the metal, slow as continental drift. A breath. The wall by the door just inhaled.